The Star of Bethlehem, fact or fiction? In fact, if you came down Water Lane this afternoon, or this evening, you can see a whole host of Stars of Bethlehem or on either side of the road. So it is indeed very seasonal. So the starting point, the inspiration for speaking about this subject is the reference to the star connected with the nativity of Jesus at Bethlehem. And you can read the entire narrative from the Gospel according to Matthew in the handout sheet. But the crucial words where the star is first mentioned are shown here. The question of these people, the Magi, to King Herod in Jerusalem. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising and have come to worship him. So on a preliminary basis, there are several questions that raise themselves about Matthew's account and its reliability and whether the star was a reality. Now, I'd like to just touch on the issue of the textual or documentary aspects of the New Testament in general and the Gospel of Matthew in particular, in comparison with the texts surviving to the 21st century from other classical writers who I've listed here at the left. So you can see the numbers as I put them up. There are comparatively small numbers of manuscripts. Sophocles is doing quite well at 193 in comparison with Plato, with only 7 surviving manuscripts of his writings. Homer is doing much better still at 643. But the New Testament, even just counting the Greek texts alone, there are over 5,700. And there, of course, are other kinds of texts besides the Greek texts, such as those in the Syriac language, that have come down to us. Now, this is a quotation from somebody who has been effectively a mentor to me, the late Professor F.F. Bruce, the world-famous biblical scholar who spent most of his career at the University of Manchester. And he said, because of the multiple manuscripts, the text of today's New Testament is 99.99% accurate. So, in comparison to the other literature that we accept from the classical world, this is doing very well on that basis. Now, for example, there is actually the oldest surviving manuscript of the New Testament that's held in Manchester in the John Rylands Library on Deansgate. This is manuscript P52. So there's a sort of local academic and scholarly interest in that. Now, as we compare the Gospels of Matthew and of Luke, that both narrate events surrounding the birth of Jesus, as we put them together, we see that there were a series of events that elapsed between the birth of Jesus as such and the visit of the Magi. And we don't need to detail those other events. You can read about them in the 2 Gospels in question. Now, Matthew's account raises quite a number of questions. First of all, is biblical literature itself reliable on such a topic? It's one thing to be generally reliable, and especially about religious questions and the revelation of God, but is it reliable when it comes to what loosely today might be termed scientific matters, or matters that impinge on science? Then there's a question of when Jesus Christ was born, of who were the Magi who came to visit him, of how far they travelled, of why they undertook the journey in the first place, and how we should interpret the star and the question of whether a known star from some parallel account fits the account in Matthew's Gospel. So these are the questions that Althea and I are planning to address in our talk together. And effectively it's in three parts. So there'll be sort of two handovers to Althea and then back to me later on. So, sorry, yeah. Can biblical literature then be reliable on this kind of question? Now, the books of the Old and New Testaments are ancient literature. We fully acknowledge that. But the fact that they are ancient literature does not, in and of itself, make them unreliable. In fact, ancient literature, because of the difficulty of producing it and the difficulty of transmitting it, made the writers of ancient literature very, very careful in how they undertook their writings. It's not like some person today with a word processor who can knock off an essay, with little trouble. They had to use the tools and technologies available to them. Now, biblical literature was written for people of all times and of all cultures. And therefore, it does not engage with or prefigure specific concerns of modern mechanistic science. So we're recognizing a limitation, if you like, or the particular purpose of that literature. Nevertheless, biblical and other ancient texts were perfectly capable of incorporating accurate accounts of natural phenomena and historical events. And specifically, in the creation narrative of Genesis, one of the purposes of the lights in the expanse of the heavens is stated, namely, let them, that is the lights in the heavens, be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. So we can ask the question, how are those lights, the celestial lights above us in the sky, fit for purpose as signs? Well, the movement of the major lights in the night sky is regular, and days and years are defined relative to those regularities. Furthermore, there is this remarkable relationship between the appearance of the moon in the sky and the appearance of the sun in the sky. That is to say, perhaps best illustrated with a diagram, that as we view both the moon and the sun from a point on Earth, they have the same apparent magnitude or size presenting itself to our eyes. And this is because the ratio of the diameters to the distance to these two celestial lights are within 3% the same figure. And therefore, the moon, as we all know, is capable from time to time of causing a total eclipse of the sun. And eclipses have been very important in the establishing of ancient chronology. And so when we have that background in our minds, the question of a special star or celestial light to signify the advent of the Messiah was also fitting. So then we move to the question of when Jesus Christ was born. Well, of course, we now reckon our calendar from the birth of Jesus. We have AD and BC, or the Christian era and before the Christian era. But there was no year 0 BC or year 0 AD. 1 BC was followed by 1 AD. And moreover, when this system of AD and BC was set up, an error was made by one of the people responsible in the 6th century, such that actually the birth of Jesus we now reckon to be in one of the years that we label BC. Now, as you know, the Magi came to visit King Herod, and he was alive at that time, we're told. But the majority of historians identify the date of his death as being in 4 BC, although there are a few that argue for 1 or 2 BC. But Jesus could have been 1 or possibly 2 years old when the Magi visited Herod, because of the edict that Herod made to kill children of the relevant age band, the slaughter of the innocents. And there is a small point that when it is said a child was 2 years old, for example, in those times, that meant that what we would say they were they'd sort of had their first birthday, they were in the second year. In other words, they were reckoned to be 1 year old in the first 12 months of their life. So altogether, a birth year within the period 5 to 6 BC is the most probable. Well, let's move on then to the question of the Magi. Well, if you've ever been to Cologne in Germany, you'll know of the famous cathedral there. And this is, by tradition, the burial place of the Magi. And there are sort of golden tombs inside the cathedral that you can visit. I'm not recommending that, but it is a beautiful cathedral. But more seriously, the Magi are known to have been a priestly group among the Medes who were skilled in astronomy and so on. And they also had the tradition of them being kings was only from the 6th century AD. And as to the reasons why they may have come, among them was the background fact that because the Old Testament people of Israel had been taken into exile into Babylon, then in that region, the Old Testament prophecies of a Saviour King, that is a Messiah, could have been disseminated and therefore known in Babylon. Furthermore, it's known that the Magi visited kings and emperors in several countries. They visited Herod in 10 BC, not necessarily the same individuals, but representatives of that same sort of priestly group. And they also sent a delegation to pay homage to Nero in Rome in AD 66, a bit like people phoning up President-elect Trump to let them know that they were keen to be on his side, perhaps. Then how distance that the Magi travelled. Well, of course, this shows the general layout with Jerusalem here and the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf over here. And a straight route across from the region of Babylonia was about 550 miles. But most people travelled around the Fertile Crescent, just like they travel around Manchester on the motorway, because although it's longer, it probably takes a bit quicker. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, when he was invading this area and he heard of trouble back home, he set off very fast and he arrived back in Babylon in 23 days. Probably a few camels died en route. But a fully loaded camel can travel about 50 to 100 miles in a day. So for the overall journey time, about a month or maybe 2 months was probably realistic. Now, it's one thing for the Magi back in Babylon to have had some notion of something portentous that might happen one day in what today we call the land of Israel. It's another thing for them to set off on their journey. So there is the question of why they did embark on their journey. And we'll try and answer this at 2 points. But the first way, in a general sense, that they must have had an unmistakably clear astronomical stroke astrological message to start them on their journey. And then we come to, obviously, the key question that lies at the heart of our presentation today, of how we should interpret the Star of Bethlehem. And there are really three kinds of interpretation, of which the first two we don't propose to attempt to deal with, because if we do, there's not much one can say, really. The first idea is that this is a made-up story, a so-called midrash, made up to satisfy Old Testament prophecy, such as a prophecy in particular in the book of Numbers. But then there's also the idea that this could be a specially created miraculous object, and this would be then, by definition, beyond the bounds of scientific or historical explanation. Or thirdly, the Star of Bethlehem could be a real astronomical or celestial phenomenon. And the criteria would be that that should, if it is the case, this should be consistent with the rather precise description in Matthew's Gospel, and which might be independently reported in ancient historical records. Now, we look at the text, and if you like to look at it also, you can look at it in the original Greek. And so we have the star at its rising. This is the better translation. It's often rendered in the east, but this expression, ente Anatole, is better rendered at its rising. And the term, the star, ton astera, is not as restrictive as our particular modern scientific understanding of what constitutes a star. Now, the characteristics of the star, then, are, from Matthew's Gospel, threefold. Number one, it had newly appeared. Number two, it travels slowly ahead of the Magi through the sky, and therefore, against the stellar background, where in our light-polluted Western world, we're not really accustomed to looking at the night sky properly. But the Magi and other people in those days were very familiar with the star background. Bethlehem, of course, is south of Jerusalem, so it travels slowly and then eventually was seen as they approached Bethlehem. And thirdly, the account says that it stood over Bethlehem. That doesn't necessarily mean over the specific house, though that is not necessarily excluded, but it stood over Bethlehem. Well, I have one more slide before I hand over to Althea, and that is just a consideration of things that we all know from our personal experience about objects in the sky. That some move slowly, some move very slowly, but some move rapidly, such as low-flying aircraft and meteorites or shooting stars. High-flying aircraft and artificial satellites move slowly, and comets and asteroids and planets move very slowly. So, Althea, over to you.
So what I'm going to try and do is look with you at what might be plausible candidates. The first thing we know, of course, is that it is not, or could not have been, a star as we understand a star. Stars don't do the things which David has just talked about. They move, but they all move together. They don't move relative to each other. They are well understood, and they just don't have the right properties, and they don't come and stand over Bethlehem. So we know it can't be a star. The second thing it could be is what's called a planetary conjunction. What that means is that we know the planets all move in the plane of the solar system, but if they happen to line up as seen from the Earth, they can look as if they're very close together. Most of the time they don't look as if they're close together, but you get occasions when they do appear quite close together, and that's called a planetary conjunction. There was one that happened in 7 BC. We'll look a bit more about that in a minute. It was noted in the 8th century AD by the Persian astrologer Mashal ibn Athari for the first time, and various other people have suggested that as well. Could it have been a nova or a supernova? That was something that Kepler was very keen on. He liked the idea of supernova, i.e. an exploding star, though he rather went off the idea eventually. But other people have also approved of that idea and followed it up subsequently. Or could it just have been the planet Venus, which can, as we know, look very bright? I'm going to look at each of these in detail and explain a little bit more about why we think we can reject all those ideas. The first was this planetary conjunction. This conjunction that occurred between Jupiter and Saturn in 7 BC was what's called a triple conjunction, which means it actually happened 3 times. The way the planets move as you look at them from the Earth actually looks as if they sometimes move backwards in a sort of looping motion. It's because of the non-completely circular orbits. But if they do that 3 times in succession, it's called a triple conjunction. So that was what they were talking about. And one of these happened in 3 BC. This is a picture of a conjunction, a planetary conjunction, obviously not the one in 7 BC. That's the sort of thing they look like. They don't get, well, it's very, very rare that they get so close that you would think they were a single object. So that seems quite unlikely from that point of view. Another problem is that they only last for a day or 2. And this phenomenon we're talking about had to last for several months to allow the Magi time to see it in different situations, decide to go to Bethlehem, etc. And these would rise and set like normal planets. And I think one of the things we probably don't realise is just how familiar the ancients were with the skies. I mean, they were sitting in a place where they had good weather, so they could see the skies most of the time. They got beautiful dark skies, no pollution, and no television. So, of course, they actually knew the skies very, very well. And something like planets, they'd known since about 600 BC. So it's not likely that they would have mistaken it. Could it have been a supernova? Well, this is a picture of a supernova appearing in the constellation Cassiopeia, which you can see here, and may perhaps recognise from having seen on the sky. Look at that picture for a second. And then what's this that's appeared here? So if I just quickly flick back, you can see where it's appeared. They are very bright, very impressive, and the well-known astronomer Tycho Brahe, I believe is the way you pronounce that, he compared his observations and showed that this particular comet, this particular supernova, Tycho's supernova in 1572, was in fact a long way away. It was beyond the distance of the moon, which was thought to be a long way in those days. So they were very distant objects. The other problem is they have a precise way of appearing in the sky. They appear very bright and then they decline pretty quickly. They decline pretty quickly to the visual, to our way of looking at them. But if you have a telescope, they leave remnants. And this is the remnant of that supernova that appeared in 1572. That's what it looks like today. It's the result of a big star having come to the end of its hydrogen burning, collapsing in and then exploding outwards violently. As I say, they can be very bright, can be very impressive, but they leave remnants, and the Star of Bethlehem doesn't seem to have left any remnant today. And then Venus. Well, what Venus might look like, and as I say, they were familiar. They knew about these planets, and I don't think they would have made any mistake as simple as suddenly thinking that Venus was telling them something new. the Mesopotamians, they had records of the risings and settings of these planets, comets, etc. As I say, from 600 and something BC, mid-7th century BC. They had this assembly of records called Enuma Anu Enlil. And this particular one here, depicted here, is actually quite a recent one, relatively recent, 164 BC. This is a recording of their viewing of Halley's Comet, which is quite impressive, a cuneiform recording of Halley's Comet. So what could the star have been? We've decided it wasn't a star, it wasn't a conjunction, it wasn't a supernova or a nova, and it wasn't a planet. The only type of astronomical object we have left that fits the three criteria that David gave us and that were reported by Matthew is a comet. So let's look at what makes comets particularly attractive as a contender for this star. The Christian writer Origen in the 3rd century AD decided that he thought it probably was a comet, a new star partaking of the nature of these celestial bodies which are sometimes called comets. He makes the point that if at the beginning of dynasties and important events you sometimes see comets, well, this was a really important event, therefore why not have a star? So what makes the comet such a good candidate? Let's look in some more detail. Characteristics of comets are that the spectacular ones can be extremely bright. And they're easily visible to the naked eye, and they stay visible to the naked eye for weeks or months. We get a bright comet very few times a century. The really bright ones are rare objects. But they can reappear. For example, we know that Halley's Comet has been back many times to visit us. And we know we can exactly predict when that's going to happen because we know its orbit. They can move slowly or rapidly, but they usually move at about 1 to 2 degrees in the sky per day. So that's not whoosh. It's moving. It's moving faster than the stars, but not incredibly fast. And we can see them twice. You can actually detect them, and I'll show you a picture of this in a minute, how it happens before they get close to the sun and then after they start coming away from the sun again. What does a comet actually look like? Well, we now know from the Rosetta mission, which sent a satellite to try and land an actual little lander called, you remember the Philae lander, which tried to land on the comet and bounced and unfortunately was lost. Well, but it showed us what the comet, this particular comet, Churyumov-Gerasimenko, I think is the right way to pronounce it, what it looked like. It's a big chunk of rather loosely bound, rocky, icy, dusty stuff. At the moment, that one was sufficiently far away from the sun that it wasn't emitting the material that formed the tail. When they get closer to the sun, the ices start melting and they start emitting different sorts of material which form the tail and the halo around the comet. And that's what makes them suddenly appear to turn on. Where they come from, this is a cartoon of the solar system, the outer parts of the solar system here. So we're looking at the sun and then the outer planets, Saturn, Uranus and Neptune. Just beyond Neptune is what's called the Kuiper Belt, and that's the source of short period comets. And then right round that is a sort of sphere of icy, rocky fragments known as the Oort cloud. And this is where the long period comets come from. Cometary orbits are what are called conic sections, which just means if you take a cone and chop it in different ways, you get these different types of orbits. You can either get a circle if you chop it parallel to the bottom, an ellipse if you chop it diagonally, a parabola, or further down, a hyperbola if you chop it so you don't get another intersection. So these are open orbits. So for example, here's your ellipse, which is a closed orbit, which is why we know when the comet's going to come back, because we know Halley is on one of these type of orbits and we know exactly when it's going to return. But if you get a comet that's on a hyperbolic orbit, which is possible, it will come in once, sweep past the sun and disappear again, never to be seen again. Long period comets, the ones that came from the Oort cloud right the long way out, you remember, like this one, take hundreds, if not tens or thousands of years to come back. And you can see if this was like the sort of comet we're expecting, it begins to turn on and become visible when the material starts to melt, about out here. It comes in towards the sun. So this is where the Magi presumably would have first detected it. It would have then vanished into the brightness of the sun, and then they would have seen it rising again in the east as it came out from the bright halo of the sun. So it could take 17,000 years to do this. What a comet actually looks like is it has a head, a nucleus, which is that rocky thing I showed you, which starts out gassing and produces a cloud of gas around it. Some of the material that's emitted is ionized by the solar radiation, and that's swept away, directly away from the sun, by the solar wind. The dust and gas that comes out otherwise tends to follow the direction of the comet's orbit and trails behind the comet. So that's the origin of these two tails you often see in pictures of comets. So the comet's tail begins as it comes into the sun, gets longer and longer as it gets towards the sun, reaches a maximum and then gets shorter again and eventually vanishes again as it recedes away from the sun. Now, I said comets can be very spectacular. Most of them are just little squibs which you wouldn't notice and nobody can see with the naked eye. But some of them are really spectacular. If they come really close to the sun to really set off that melting and the producing of the tail, and they come really close to us on the way out and we get a good view, then they can look something like this. This was called the Great Comet of 1577. Nice woodcut here from Prague. And you can see that that was something that was occupying a large fraction of the visible sky. It really would have been quite a stunning object. And you can also see why people thought they looked like scimitars or swords. This is Halley's comet. We actually know that the comet related to Christ couldn't have been Halley's comet because it came back in 12 BC, which is too early. But this is what Halley's comet looked like earlier this century. It's been back since then. And this is just to indicate that comets were not always thought to be bringers of good news. You can see here there's some consternation on the Bayeux tapestry, 1066. The comet was seen in the sky, that's Halley's comet. People are pretty worried about it here, and poor old Harold doesn't look too happy at all. Comets were quite often seen as bad news, bad portents. So something that the ancients would be watching for quite carefully. They're frequently, as I say, described as swords, and we have a lot of ancient literature relating to comets. This is some Roman literature referring to them as a sign like a column and a blazing for 30 days, columns standing in the sky if they were more vertical. And these were the shapes of comets that Pliny drew and recorded. So varying from the stage where they're just beginning to light up, the coma's just beginning to glow, to the stage where they've fully been round the sun and developed a very distinctive tail, and in fact sometimes a double tail, as I've mentioned. However, the real aces at spotting comets and recording them were the Chinese, and there is enormous, extensive Chinese ancient literature classifying and recording appearances of comets. And as you can see, they had a great range of comets they recorded, all sorts of different types of tails. That's an interesting one, I'm not quite sure what that one was. But they did keep very careful astronomical records. They're the best records we've got. They go back again to about 600 BC. They had these different ways of describing them as a broom star if it had a tail, or posing if it didn't have a tail, if it was just the coma. They even described novae as guest stars, so they were distinguishing between the different types of stars at that stage. Their records, as I say, were pretty complete, and they're the best ones we've got, and it is possible to track back historical comets right back through the Chinese records. However, we do not know that they are absolutely complete. We don't know if there's anything they missed, so that's always a caveat when looking at the ancient records, either the Chinese or Western ones. And that brings me to this book, which is the most recent, I think it's the most recent, it's 2015, treatment of the Star of Bethlehem by this chap, Colin Nichol, who did his PhD at Cambridge and then became a biblical scholar and has taught in biblical and theological colleges. It's very interesting. If anybody's interested enough to want to follow this up further, he has amassed a huge amount of detail here. He's looked at all the biblical references, he's looked at all the astronomical contenders, and really done a thorough job in developing this case that it was a comet. He also goes a bit further and has quite an extensive section, sort of astrological section, on why it might have so impressed the Magi. But that's not really within our remit tonight. He summarises this biblical evidence very carefully, investigates the hypotheses made previously, and on the basis of making quite a lot of assumptions, he makes a model, because it's now possible to quite easily get hold of software which will move the sky backwards for you to whatever date you want to go back to. And so he's been able to model the properties of a comet which he thinks fits the biblical evidence. It resulted in a comet in 6 BC with a very, very elliptical orbit. So it would have been a long period comet with a very close passage to the sun and the earth, and being very bright. He called it the most magnificent comet in human history. The only problem is that there aren't any parallel records. Now, as I've said, maybe the records failed, but there aren't any parallel records. So, where do we go from here? Well, let's have a look at some of the other contenders for the comet as seen by the Magi. I'm going to hand back to David at this stage to talk about the comet star as the Magi would have experienced it.
Thank you, Althea. So, we'll consider then a little more detail about the journey of the Magi and the movement of the star. We previously concluded that it's probable that the journey time from Babylon to Jerusalem was about 1 month or a little more. And in 1 month, from their perspective, and in round figures, the star moved from through an angle of 90 degrees, we might say. That is to say, they saw it first in the east, at its rising, and then in the south, later on over Bethlehem, after they'd visited Herod in Jerusalem. Now, in 1 month, the stellar background that Althea was speaking about would move by 30 degrees, because in the course of a year, the stellar background, of course, moves 360 degrees, or a complete circle. And so in 1 month, if they saw it first in the east and then 90 degrees, so to speak, move further on, it was a net movement of 60 degrees, 30, subtracting the 30 degrees by which the stellar background itself moved. And so if it moved in the month 60 degrees, then that's 2 degrees of movement in the sky per day. And that is typical of a comet. as it moves again in the sky, as I say, through against the moving stellar background. So on the last lap of their journey, then, according to the narrative in Matthew, having had their discussion with Herod, they set off to go on to Bethlehem, which is 6 miles to the south, and so easily covered in a journey time of 1 to 2 hours on camelback. And so the Magi then set off in the morning, and they saw the comet ahead of them, or the star ahead of them, in the sky in the morning sky. So again, looking exactly at the text in our translations and in our original Greek New Testament, the star went ahead of them. Again, it's the same word, the astera, and this expression here is best translated, sometimes translated stopped, but a better translation is stood over the place where the child was. And, you can look up in various sources, of Greek lexicons and so on, to verify that fact. So it stood over the place where the child was, which, as I say, was certainly Bethlehem, according to the account, but not necessarily the exact house. Now, therefore, let's consider the ability of comets to stand over a district. And here in this slide here, you see that a comet viewing a horizon ahead of you, it's possible for a comet to appear to stand over a fairly precise region of the land ahead of you. And then, now this is a painting, but it's accepted by scholars as an accurate representation of Donati's comet that stood over Paris in 1858. And there you see the artist, the painter, has represented the two kinds of tails very accurately. And indeed, you're standing on one of those bridges on the Seine, on the River Seine, and the comet looks, you would say it's standing over Paris, just like the other literature spoke about comets standing over cities like Rome. And then there's this, I think, particularly stunning example, Comet McNaught. And as you see, in this case, the cometary tail is very complex, but clearly it has a head. It's almost like a pointing finger that says, sort of X marks the spot. Incidentally, on this coin, a Roman silver coin, a denarius from the reign of Augustus Caesar, on the reverse side of the coin, there is a stylized representation of comets. So these were regarded as auspicious celestial phenomena in relation to the reigns of kings. Now, according to the Chinese records that Althea introduced to us, there were the following comets seen within the period of interest. So there was, as she mentioned, there's Halley's Comet in 12 BC, and that was the description in the Chinese records. There was one in 5 BC, which was a tailed comet, and then there's another one in 4 BC. There's further detail about this in Sir Colin Humphrey's book, article in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society back in 1991, and also an older paper here in that journal. But if we consider, that broad period in terms of extant Chinese records, we can delete the first one and we can delete the third one, This one is in April, when Herod is believed or known to have died in March of that year. So that could not have been the comet that was present in his lifetime. And so the only contender as far as these particular records go is that one in 5 BC, which was a tail comet, which, as we've just been shown, would be a particularly clear and dramatic one. So, of the signs in the sky, we can say, why did the Magi begin their journey? Well, there was a probable combination of astronomical events. Although we have not gone along with the idea of this conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in 7 BC, nevertheless it was something of interest that an avid astronomer, astrologer would have noted. And then there was also a conjunction of Mars, Saturn and Jupiter in 6 BC. And then there was this one. There is the possibility of a further bright comet in 6 BC or 5 BC. And certainly the then current astrological interpretations identified this as a portentous of a great king. And for more detailed reasons, we haven't time to go into a king specifically in Israel. And so we come to essentially the end or conclusion of our story in part, though we'll express some conclusions in a moment. But here in this chapel in Padua, which I happened to visit while on holiday there earlier this year, these paintings are murals. They're kept in a very temperature and high humidity and environmentally controlled total environment, so they don't get destroyed. But there is the Star of Bethlehem is depicted in that mural. So I would like to say we can draw some conclusions that we could call level 1 and level 2. So the level 1 conclusions would be that the general comet characteristics are uniquely consistent with the criteria arising from Matthew's account in comparison with the other kinds of identification, such as planetary conjunctions. And we've been discussing these, of course, that it newly appeared, that it was visible from Babylon and all the way to Jerusalem and then Bethlehem, that it slowly travelled again through the night sky against the stellar background, that it was able to stand over a district, especially one viewed as approached and seeing this district on the horizon. And so level 1, we contend, is a demonstrable level, and so that's why we focused upon that. And you know, we'd be quite happy to sort of stop any conclusions at that point. But there is the level 2 issue of whether you can specifically identify the comets with respect to, for example, Chinese secular records. And, well, we could say this is partly demonstrable. That several possible comet identifications have been made by Colin Humphreys and Colin Nichol and others. But we are, as presenters, cautious about a categorical identification with a specific comet from secular records. But nevertheless, the non-cometary celestial phenomena, such as those conjunctions, may have alerted the Magi in the years immediately preceding the appearance of the comet Star of Bethlehem, and so that they were then ready to set off on their epic journey from the east to discover and to worship the young child who had been born. And in all considerations of the Star of Bethlehem, we can be very taken up with the subject of the star itself And of course, this is absolutely legitimate and necessary. But of course, the wonder of the universe is the one to whom the star pointed, and of whom in the New Testament elsewhere it says, though he was rich, yet for your sake, for our sake, he became poor. So with that we conclude. Thank you for your attention.